There is a chicken that once held a title no bird before or since has ever taken from her. She laid 364 eggs in 365 days. Not under heat lamps and pharmaceutical feed schedules, not inside a wire cage stacked 4 rows high in a windowless barn, but in an open yard, under ordinary sunlight, nearly 100 years ago. She never got sick. She tolerated freezing winters and brutal summers without a heated coop or a single antibiotic. And today, most Americans have never heard her name, never seen her breed, and have no idea that the chicken sitting in their grocery store carton is descended from something engineered to replace her. This is the story of the Black Australorp, and why an industry that could have built itself around the most efficient, hardiest layer ever recorded, chose instead to quietly let her disappear. To understand how something this remarkable nearly vanished, you have to go back to where it began, half a world away, in the pastures outside Sydney, Australia, in the final years of the 1800s. Australian poultry breeders had gotten their hands on Black Orpingtons, a breed developed in England prized for size and meat quality, but never bred specifically for laying. The Australians, practical to their bones, and running farms that depended on every bird pulling its weight, weren't interested in a chicken that just looked impressive. They wanted output, so they crossed those Orpingtons with Langshans for hardiness, threw in some Minorca and white Leghorn blood for laying stamina, and kept only the offspring that produced. Generation after generation, they selected ruthlessly for one thing: eggs. Not appearance, not feather color, not show ring standards. Eggs, consistently, reliably, through heat and cold and drought. What came out the other end of that breeding program was a solid, glossy black bird with a greenish-purple sheen across her feathers, calm enough to be handled by children, hardy enough to shrug off harsh weather, and productive enough to embarrass every other breed on the continent. They called her the Australian Black Orpington at first, and then simply shortened it to Australorp, a name that fused the country of her origin with the breed that gave her a start. By 1902, at an agricultural college trial in Hawkesbury, these birds were already turning heads. But it was 2 decades later, in the winter contests of 1922 and 1923, that the Australorp did something no chicken in recorded history had done before, or has done since under natural conditions. A pen of 6 Australorp hens laid 1,857 eggs across 365 consecutive days, an average of over 309 eggs per bird. And then, almost as if to make the point unmistakable, a single hen from that same bloodline broke away from the pack entirely and laid 364 eggs in 365 days. 1 egg short of laying every single day for an entire year, without artificial lighting, without modern vitamin supplementation, without any of the industrial tools that would later be marketed as necessary for high production. News of that record didn't stay in Australia for long. Poultry breeders in America, Britain, and South Africa heard about a bird that could outlay anything they had, and by the mid-1920s, Black Australorps were being imported and bred across small farms throughout the United States. In 1929, the American Poultry Association formally recognized the breed, giving it a permanent place in the official standard of perfection, the closest thing the poultry world has to a Hall of Fame. For a stretch of years afterward, the Australorp wasn't a niche curiosity. It was, by many accounts, one of the most desirable dual-purpose birds a small farmer in America could own. Good layer, good meat bird when her laying years were behind her. Calm temperament that made her easy to manage around kids and other livestock. Cold-hardy enough for northern winters, heat-tolerant enough for southern summers. She was, on paper and in practice, close to the perfect farmyard chicken. So here's the question that should be nagging at you right now. If this bird was that good, if she held a laying record that has never been matched by any bird under those same natural, unforced conditions, why isn't she the chicken sitting in every backyard coop and every commercial layer house in the country today? Why did most Americans grow up never once hearing her name? The answer starts Like so many stories about American agriculture, in the years right after the Second World War, when the entire structure of how this country raised chickens got rebuilt from the ground up, and not by farmers. Before the war, poultry farming in the United States looked a lot like it had for 100 years before that. Small and mid-sized farms kept flocks of dual-purpose breeds, birds that could lay eggs and eventually become meat, because that flexibility mattered when you were running a farm and not a factory. Breeds like the Australorp, the Plymouth Rock, the Rhode Island Red, the Wyandotte, thrived in that world because they were built for it. They bred true, meaning a farmer could hatch this year's flock from last year's eggs without buying new stock, generation after generation, without ever needing to go back to a hatchery. That single fact, the ability to breed true and reproduce your own flock indefinitely, is the quiet detail that explains almost everything that happened next. After the war, a new philosophy took hold in American agriculture, driven by companies that had spent the war years perfecting large-scale production, standardization, and supply chain efficiency, and were now looking for the next industry to remake in that image. Poultry was an obvious target. In 1946, a Delaware-based company named A. Bocking Chase and a grocery chain conglomerate sponsored something called the Chicken of Tomorrow contest, a nationwide competition explicitly designed to identify and promote a chicken breed optimized purely for rapid growth, breast meat yield, and feed efficiency, judged the way you'd judge a manufactured product rather than a living animal that had to survive winters and forage and raise itself. The winning bloodlines out of that contest became the genetic foundation for the modern broiler industry, and companies like Vantris Hatchery later absorbed into what became the Cobb Vantris operation still dominant today, began selectively breeding hybrid birds engineered for one purpose and one purpose only, whether that was meat production or egg laying, at a speed and scale no heritage dual-purpose breed could match. On the egg-laying side, the same transformation happened in parallel. Companies developed hybrid layers, commercial crosses like the ISA Brown, and later strains from Highline and Lohman, birds engineered specifically to hit peak lay rates faster and more predictably than any heritage breed, under confined, controlled indoor conditions where natural hardiness and foraging ability didn't matter because the birds would never see a pasture or a Midwestern winter to begin with. These hybrids were remarkable in their own right. Under ideal industrial conditions, a top commercial layer can outproduce almost anything for the first year or two of her life. But there was a catch built directly into the genetics, and it wasn't an accident. Hybrid layers are crosses, meaning their parent lines are kept separate and proprietary by the breeding companies that develop them, and the offspring of two hybrids do not reliably reproduce the same traits. A farmer who tried to breed his own flock from hybrid layer offspring would get birds with wildly inconsistent laying performance, nothing close to what the parent generation delivered. In practice, this meant that any farm that switched to commercial hybrid layers could never again breed its own replacement flock. It had to go back to the hatchery, year after year, generation after generation, and buy new chicks, forever. That is not a side effect of the technology. That is the business model. Compare that to a Black Australorp, or any true heritage breed, which breeds true generation after generation. A farmer who kept Australorps in 1935 could, in principle, still be breeding descendants of that same flock today, never having spent another dollar buying replacement stock beyond the occasional outside blood to keep the gene pool healthy. From a farmer's perspective, that's independence. From the perspective of a hatchery trying to build a recurring revenue business, that same independence is the single biggest threat to the model. A breed that farmers never need to rebuy is a breed that generates exactly one sale and then nothing, forever, while a hybrid that must be repurchased every single generation generates revenue indefinitely, locking every farm that adopts it into permanent dependence on a small handful of breeding companies. By the 1950s and 60s, agricultural extension offices across the country, funded and staffed in coordination with the very industry that stood to benefit, were actively steering small farmers toward these new hybrid lines, promoting them as modern, scientific, and efficient, while heritage dual-purpose breeds like the Australorp were quietly recast as old-fashioned, inefficient, a relic of a less advanced era of farming. It's a familiar pattern to anyone who has looked closely at what happened to heirloom seed varieties in the same decades, when hybrid and later patented seed lines pushed out open-pollinated varieties that farmers had saved and replanted for generations, replacing agricultural self-sufficiency with a permanent subscription model dressed up as progress. The Livestock Conservancy, the leading nonprofit tracking the health of heritage livestock breeds in America, eventually placed the Black Australorp on its threatened breeds list, an official acknowledgement that a bird once celebrated as the greatest layer the world had ever recorded had, within a few short decades, become rare enough to require active conservation to keep from disappearing entirely. Not because she stopped laying eggs, not because farmers stopped wanting hardy, self-sufficient flocks, but because the entire economic structure of American poultry farming had been rebuilt around a model that had no place for a bird nobody ever had to buy twice. This is where our story turns from history into something a lot more personal, because numbers and industry consolidation only tell you so much. To really understand what got lost, you need to meet somebody who found it again. In the rolling hill country outside a small town in the Missouri Ozarks, on a piece of land that had been in his family for 4 generations, a 61-year-old farmer named Everett Kessler was cleaning out his late grandfather's old equipment shed when he came across a cracked leather ledger tucked behind a shelf of rusted tools. His grandfather, a man named Otis Kessler, had kept detailed farm records going back to the 1930s, the kind of meticulous handwritten logs that farmers of that generation kept out of necessity rather than sentiment. Everett had inherited the farm nearly 2 decades earlier and had spent most of those years running a modest cattle operation, the same way most of his neighbors had shifted their family land toward beef as row crop margins tightened and the local dairy co-op finally closed its doors for good back in 2019. He hadn't thought much about the ledger until he sat down that evening and started reading. Otis Kessler had kept chickens. That much Everett already knew. What he hadn't known, what nobody in the family had ever mentioned, was that his grandfather's flock in the 1930s and 40s had been Black Australorps, purchased originally from a breeder 2 counties over who claimed direct bloodline connections back to the original Australian import stock that had come into the country in the 1920s. Otis's ledger recorded egg counts with the same obsessive precision he clearly applied to everything else on the farm, and reading through page after page, Everett watched his grandfather's flock consistently lay at rates that, compared to what he vaguely understood about modern commercial birds, seemed almost impossible for chickens that had never once seen a heat lamp or a bag of medicated feed. Curious in the way that a slow winter and an empty equipment shed can make a person curious, Everett started digging. He found an old newspaper clipping tucked between 2 pages of the ledger, yellowed and brittle, from a paper called the Ozark Ridge Gazette, dated 1938, covering a regional poultry exhibition where an Australorp hen from a neighboring farm had taken top honors in a laying competition. The clipping mentioned the Australian world record almost in passing, as if in 1938 that fact was simply common knowledge among anyone who kept chickens, not the obscure historical footnote it would become decades later. Everett, a practical man not given to sentimentality about the past for its own sake, found himself unable to shake the question the ledger had planted in his head. If this breed had been this good, reliable enough that his grandfather trusted his family's food supply to her, hardy enough to survive an Ozark winter with nothing more than a drafty wooden coop, why had he never once, in 61 years of living on this land, actually seen one? He started making calls. A few local feed stores had never heard of the breed at all. The Regional Agricultural Extension Office pointed him toward general poultry resources but had nothing specific on Australorps. It was only when he reached out to the Livestock Conservancy directly, after finding their name buried in an old farming forum thread, that he finally got a real answer. And it wasn't the answer he expected. A conservation coordinator on the phone walked him through the post-war history of hybrid layer development, the Chicken of Tomorrow contest, the deliberate industry shift toward proprietary, non-reproducing bloodlines, and the slow marginalization of heritage dual-purpose breeds that couldn't compete on paper with hybrid production numbers, even though those numbers only held up under conditions no small farm could ever replicate or afford. She told him something that stuck with him for weeks afterward. The Australorp hadn't disappeared because she failed. She disappeared because an industry rebuilding itself around recurring revenue had no room for a bird that only had to be bought once. Everett sat with that for a long time. He'd spent 2 decades running cattle on this land, watching hay prices climb and grazing land values creep steadily upward, even as smaller operations around him folded one by one, watching the same consolidation pressure that had hollowed out the local dairy co-op work its way through nearly every corner of small-scale agriculture he could see. He understood, in a way that took real years of farming to understand, exactly how an industry could quietly restructure itself around what served the biggest players rather than what served the land or the people working it. What he hadn't expected was to find that same story sitting in his grandfather's chicken coop. So he made a decision that surprised even his own family. He was going to find real Black Australorps, the closest thing left to that original bloodline, and bring the breed back onto his land. It turned out to be harder than he expected. The breed's threatened status meant reputable breeders were scattered and small, most keeping flocks of a few dozen birds rather than the hundreds a commercial hatchery would maintain. Everett spent the better part of a spring tracking down leads, driving 3 hours to a small heritage poultry operation in southern Iowa that had been quietly preserving Australorp bloodlines for over a decade, run by a woman who'd inherited her own breeding stock from a poultry club that had all but dissolved by the 1990s. As members aged out and younger farmers gravitated toward the commercial hybrids, everyone assumed were simply the modern standard. She sold him 15-day-old chicks and 2 mature breeding hens, along with a stack of photocopied breed standard documents and a warning that Australorps, while hardy, needed protection from predators just like any other bird, and that patience during the first laying season would matter more than he might expect. Back home, Everett converted an old equipment shed, not far from where he'd found his grandfather's ledger in the first place, into a proper coop, insulated against the worst of the Ozark winter, but ventilated enough to avoid the moisture problems that plague poorly designed henhouses. He built nesting boxes according to the old specifications in his grandfather's notes, added a modest run, fenced against the coyotes, that occasionally worked their way down from the timber above his property line, and settled in to wait through that first uncertain season the way any farmer waits when they've bet real money and real effort on something unproven. The chicks grew through that first summer the way chicks do, awkward and then suddenly not, and by early fall the pullets began laying. Everett kept his own version of his grandfather's ledger, tracking egg counts by hand the same obsessive way Otis once had, and watched with something close to vindication as the numbers came in steady, consistent, week after week, through a fall that brought an early frost and a winter that dropped well below freezing for stretches at a time. The birds barely slowed down. No heat lamp, no medicated feed, no antibiotics. Just a well-built coop, decent forage, and a breed that had been engineered 100 years earlier by farmers who cared about exactly the kind of resilience Everett needed on a working farm in the Ozarks. It wasn't until the following spring that the real test came, when a wave of avian influenza swept through poultry operations across several Midwestern states, the kind of outbreak that had become grimly familiar to anyone following agricultural news over the preceding several years, forcing commercial operations to cull entire flocks by the tens of thousands to contain the spread. Everett watched the local news coverage with the particular dread of someone who now had real skin in the game, but his flock, kept outdoors with reasonable but not obsessive biosecurity, isolated from the dense confinement conditions where disease moves fastest through genetically uniform, immune system compromised commercial birds, came through the season without a single loss. He couldn't prove definitively that breed hardiness alone explained it. Disease outbreaks are messy and multifactorial, but he noticed, and he wasn't alone in noticing, that the heritage breed forums and conservation groups he'd started following were full of similar stories. Small flocks of hardy heritage birds weathering outbreaks that devastated the genetically uniform, densely confined populations that make up the overwhelming majority of America's commercial egg supply. That's the twist buried inside this whole story. The part that turns a nostalgic tale about an old family farm into something with real, uncomfortable relevance to how this country currently feeds itself. The same genetic uniformity that made hybrid layers so profitable, The tight, controlled breeding lines that ensured every bird performed identically, and none of them could reproduce independently of the company that engineered them, also stripped out the genetic diversity that gives a population resilience against disease. When you breed millions of birds down to a handful of proprietary bloodlines, optimized purely for peak production under ideal industrial conditions, you get extraordinary short-term output and extraordinary long-term fragility. A poultry industry that can produce eggs at a staggering scale right up until the moment a virus finds its way into a barn housing 80,000 nearly identical, immune system-taxed birds, at which point the entire operation can collapse in a matter of days. It's not a coincidence that egg prices have swung so wildly in recent years, spiking dramatically during major outbreak periods, because a system built for efficiency rather than resilience has almost no slack built in when something goes wrong. Heritage breeds like the Australorp were never going to win a pure numbers competition against a hybrid layer optimized for a climate-controlled barn with unlimited feed and pharmaceutical support. But that was never really the honest comparison. The real question a farm should be asking isn't which bird lays the most eggs under perfect conditions. It's which bird keeps laying, keeps surviving, keeps reproducing itself without outside intervention, when conditions aren't perfect, when a winter runs colder than expected, when a virus moves through the region, when supply chains get disrupted, and a farm can't simply order more chicks from a hatchery 3 states away. Under that question, the Australorp's record isn't a quaint historical footnote. It's a data point the industry spent 70 years actively steering farmers away from. Because a bird that could take care of herself and reproduce herself indefinitely was never going to generate the recurring revenue that built the modern poultry industry into what it is today. Everett didn't set out to make some grand statement about agricultural policy when he cracked open his grandfather's old ledger. He just wanted to know why a chicken that good had disappeared from a farm that had once relied on her. But 2 years into rebuilding that flock, he'd become something he never expected. A small but genuine node in the loose, scattered network of heritage breed keepers working, mostly quietly and without much recognition, to keep genetic diversity alive in American agriculture, at exactly the moment industry consolidation has made that diversity more fragile than at almost any point in the country's history. Word got around the way it does in a small farming community, first through the local feed store, then through a segment on a regional agricultural radio program, and eventually the Ozark Ridge Gazette, the same paper that had run that yellowed 1938 clipping Everett found tucked in his grandfather's ledger, sent a reporter out to do a feature on the Kessler Farms Australorp revival, tracing the thread from Otis's original flock in the 1930s through the decades of decline to Everett's rebuilding effort. The piece ran with a photo of Everett standing in the converted equipment shed, one of his black hens perched calmly on his forearm, and it did something he hadn't anticipated. It brought calls, first from neighbors curious about starting their own small flocks, and eventually from people well outside the county who'd read about the story online after it got picked up and shared by a couple of heritage livestock accounts. Everett had never planned on becoming a breeder himself, but demand has a way of shaping decisions, and within another 2 seasons, he was hatching and selling small batches of Australorp chicks to families and small farms across 3 counties, always careful to keep back enough breeding stock to maintain a genetically healthy flock of his own, mindful of exactly the mistake the industry had made decades earlier by narrowing bloodlines down until resilience gave way to fragility. He kept his grandfather's ledger on a shelf in the farmhouse kitchen, and he kept his own version going right alongside it, a habit that had started as simple record-keeping and had turned into something closer to a thread connecting 4 generations of a family that had, almost by accident, ended up preserving a small piece of agricultural history that the broader industry had spent most of a century trying to write out of the story. What happened on the Kessler farm is a small story. 1 family, 1 flock, 1 converted equipment shed in the Missouri Ozarks. But it sits inside a much larger pattern playing out across American agriculture right now, one that goes well beyond chickens. The same forces that pushed Black Australorps to the margins, the shift from farmer-owned, self-reproducing genetics toward proprietary, company-controlled bloodlines that require permanent repurchasing, played out almost identically in seed corn, in soybeans, in hog breeding, in dairy cattle genetics. In every case, the pitch was the same: Modern, scientific, efficient, an upgrade from the old-fashioned ways. And in every case, what actually happened underneath that pitch was a transfer of control away from individual farms and toward a small number of companies that could turn every single growing season, every single generation of livestock, into a recurring transaction rather than a one-time investment a family could build on indefinitely. None of this means the modern hybrid layer or the modern hybrid seed corn is worthless, or that every farmer who adopted them made a mistake. Under the right conditions, with the right infrastructure and the right market, these engineered varieties genuinely do produce more, faster, and that increased output has fed a lot of people. But efficiency and resilience are not the same thing, and an agricultural system that optimizes entirely for the first while quietly sacrificing the second is a system running without a safety net, one that looks unstoppable right up until the moment a drought, a disease outbreak, or a supply chain disruption exposes exactly how little slack was ever built into the design. The steady drumbeat of headlines about historic low cattle inventories, about elevated land values pushing young farmers out of the market entirely, about generational transition on family farms stalling out because the next generation can't afford to buy in. These aren't separate problems from the story of a disappearing chicken breed. They're symptoms of the same underlying shift, an agricultural economy increasingly organized around scale and recurring revenue, rather than around the kind of durable, self-sufficient farming that used to define places like the hill country outside Everett Kessler's farm. There's a reason movements around regenerative agriculture, heritage breed conservation, and seed saving have been quietly gaining ground over the last several years, even as the broader industry consolidates further in the opposite direction. Farmers who lived through drought years, through wild swings in input costs, through supply chain shocks that left them unable to source replacement stock or seed exactly when they needed it most, started asking the same question Everett Kessler ended up asking almost by accident. What happens to my farm if I can't buy what I need this year? For a farmer running proprietary hybrid layers, or patented seed corn, or company-controlled hog genetics, that question doesn't have a good answer. For a farmer running a self-reproducing heritage breed, it does. That difference, invisible in a good year, becomes the entire ballgame in a bad one. Everett's flock today numbers just under 200 birds across a rotating set of breeding groups, carefully managed to avoid the genetic bottlenecking that plagued the breed decades ago when its numbers dropped low enough to land on the Livestock Conservancy's threatened list. The Australorp has since been reclassified by the Conservancy as a recovering breed, still far from common, but no longer teetering on the edge the way it was a generation ago, thanks in no small part to a scattered network of small farms and backyard keepers, people like Everett, who decided a bird this remarkable was worth the effort of bringing back, even without any corporate marketing budget behind her, even without a single advertisement telling them she was worth the trouble. Standing in that converted equipment shed on a cold morning last winter, watching his hens move calmly through their routine, unbothered by the freezing temperature outside, Everett Kessler said something to the reporter from the Ozark Ridge Gazette that ended up as the closing line of that feature story, the line that got quoted again and again as the piece circulated online. He said his grandfather never wrote in that ledger why he chose Australorps over any other breed available to him in the 1930s. He didn't have to. Otis Kessler was running a farm that had to survive on its own, year after year, without a hatchery 3 states away to bail him out if something went wrong. He picked a bird that could take care of itself, because in that world, that was the only kind of bird worth having. 70 years and one industry-wide transformation later, his grandson picked her again, for exactly the same reason. If this story surprised you the way it surprised us when we started digging into it, you're not alone. And you're probably wondering what else got quietly pushed out of American agriculture the same way, replaced not because it stopped working, but because it stopped generating recurring profit for somebody else. Drop a comment and let us know if you've ever raised heritage breed poultry yourself, or if this is the first time you're hearing the Black Australorp's name at all. If you want to see more stories like this one, stories about the parts of farming history that got left out of the official narrative, subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and share this with anyone you know who still believes bigger and more industrial always means better. We'll see you in the next story.